Well,
of course.
thank you so much for being here in our seminar. I'm so glad to be able to listen to your work on Ficino and Theophrastus. So if it's okay with you, we can start.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here, as I said, and thank you very much for having me. And it's a pleasure to meet all of you, even though virtually. So I will be talking about Ficino's interpretation of Theophrastus' view of the mind. As you can guess from the title, I have prepared a handout with some quotation in English, and then I've given you the Greek and the Latin together with the English translation. So I will be reading the quotations out, but you can, hopefully I will be able to share the screen and you can read the quotations yourself. So I'll have the first try in sharing the screen. So we can start off with this beautiful image. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Very good. And you can see me as well.
Yes.
Okay. So when one thinks of philosophy in the Italian Renaissance, perhaps the first image which comes to mind is the School of Athens in the Stanza della Signatura, now in the Vatican Museum, where Raphael juxtaposes Plato and Aristotle. Here we see the two central figures of the painting. Plato is famously gesturing towards the heavens, and Aristotle towards the earth. And all of us today, at least in this meeting, I guess, are very familiar to seeing them paired together, to see them together. And but when this painting, when Raphael painted these frescoes between 1509 and 1511, only 25 years had passed since the Latin translation of the entire corpus of Platonic dialogues had been published in Florence in 1484. An event which for the first time allowed the Latin West to have direct access. So the publication of... I heard someone speaking.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So the publication of Ficino, Plato's, the translation of Plato's dialogues by Marsilio Ficino in 1484 was an event which allowed the Latin West for the first time to have direct access to the entirety of Plato's works. This new access, as is known, marked a crucial moment in the history of Platonic scholarship. However, it had significant consequences also in the reception of Aristotle. For even though during the Middle Ages tons of ink had been spilled on dissecting Aristotle's mind, the rediscovery of Plato encouraged a re-evaluation of some of Aristotle's positions in the light of those doctrines which had initiated Aristotle to the study of philosophy. The hope was to find out whether Aristotle did actually depart from his master, or if he remained his faithful, though critical student. This question, crucial to many, long exercised the scholar who authored the Latin translation of Plato's dialogues, the Italian Marsilio Ficino, born in 1433. Having translated and commented not only on the Platonic dialogues, but also on Plotinus, Iamblichus of the Mysteries, some of Porphyry, Synesius, some of Proclus, and having himself written a Platonic theology, Ficino's name is tightly bound to that of Plato. In fact, Ficino considered himself to be the herald of Platonism in the Latin West, and he would be happy to know that today we still regard him as such. However, I hope to show that even though Ficino is unquestionably a Platonist, Aristotle is a constant presence in his writings, and that by engaging with Plato, and especially with Plotinus, Ficino engages with Aristotle too. Is passionate about reviving Plato, but is equally passionate about reviving the original Aristotle. The Aristotle who, in Ficino's view, had been transformed into a non-Platonist by centuries of wrong readings and misleading interpretations. In Ficino's view, two philosophers in particular had been responsible for this transformation: Alexander of Aphrodisias and Averroes. Unfortunately, I have to be very short, very concise here, and so I'll pay the price of not doing justice to the complex relationship that Ficino had with both Alexander and Averroes, and especially with Averroes. But to explore this relationship will take me more than the time I have for this paper. So I'll just mention briefly why Ficino strongly opposed these two philosophers, because this is essential to understand why he saw in Theophrastus Aristotle's faithful interpreter. The reasons are easy to guess for anyone who knows Alexander and Averroes. And is that for Ficino, they had made Aristotle say something that Aristotle would have never wanted to say. That is, that the human intellect is mortal. Averroes, because he denied that the individual human mind is intellectual and immortal by its own nature. And I must clarify here that probably this is obvious, but it's better that I say a few words just not to get into misunderstanding of the Averroes that I'm talking about is Ficino's Averroes, that is the Latin Averroes, the Averroes of the long commentary on the De Anima and the Latin translation of the first half of the 13th century, and that Ficino knew especially through Aquinas. Ficino ignored the different stages in the development of Averroes' teachings on the intellect, which, as is now agreed, are reflected in Averroes' three commentaries on Aristotle's De Anima: the short commentary, the middle commentary, and the long commentary. In fact, as far as I know, the short commentary was never translated into Latin, while the middle commentary was translated into Latin at the end of the 15th century from an Hebrew translation, and we have no evidence that Ficino have ever read it. So I will be talking here about the Latin Averroes. Ficino blames him particularly for having described the material intellect in terms of pure potentiality, which seems to relegate the mind to the very lowest position in the scale of being, as close to nothingness as matter. Book 15 of Ficino's magnum opus, the Platonic Theology, written between 1469 and 1474, but published in 1482, is entirely devoted to dismantling the central doctrines of Averroes' philosophy, including the identification of the Nous pathetikos with pure potentiality. And now I'd like to share a fair quotation number 1 in the handout. So it tells me you are seeing the handout. So quotation number 1. So with the Averroes, the agent intellect is a particular substance in act, since it does something, and there is no doubt about this, and we don't challenge that. However, when they add that the receptive intellect is another substance, and of such a kind that is pure potency like prime matter, we don't agree. For where the receptive mind, pure potency, it would not be distinguished from prime matter. Wherever matter existed, understanding would be there, such that even the stones would understand. So we can see that from the times of the Platonic theology, Ficino was concerned with showing that Averroes' view of the intellect was not what Aristotle had in mind. Thus, it's not surprised that when later in his life he gained access to a manuscript containing Theophrastus on the soul, where we will see Theophrastus endeavors to prevent readings of the Nous patheticos, pure potentiality, Ficino's long-standing hermeneutical desire to read the De Anima on the soul in the spirit of Aristotle, in the truest spirit of Aristotle, was immediately fulfilled. So Ficino read Theophrastus' commentary on Aristotle's De Anima in the paraphrase by Priscianus Lidus, a 6th century Platonist who supposedly went to Persia together with other 6 philosophers when the Emperor Justinian closed the Athenian school in 529, until the king of Persia negotiated their return to Athens 4 years later. The paraphrase is based upon the 4th and 5th books of Theophrastus' 8th book, Physica, of which only some extracts survive, but which is listed as among Theophrastus' writings in Diogenes Laertius' Lives. As I said, the 4th and 5th books form part of what must have been Theophrastus' commentary on Aristotle's De Anima. As I said, we have only some fragments preserved primarily in Priscianus' paraphrase, the text that Ficino translated and commented on, but also in Themistius' De Anima and in other minor sources, including Iamblichus and Simplicius. Many of the passages quoted by Priscianus, of which a large part of the paraphrase of Priscianus, a large part is lost, but many of the passages that he quotes coincide with those given by Themistius, which confirm the accuracy of Priscianus. However, the paraphrase is far from being a faithful narration of Theophrastus' account of Aristotle's view on the soul. Priscianus' intention was certainly to study Theophrastus' commentary in the hope to gain a better understanding of Aristotle's psychology. However, there's much more going on in the paraphrase. For Priscianus' studies is imbued with elements coming from the late ancient Platonic tradition, especially from Iamblichus. The result of this method is a Theophrastus transformed by Iamblichus. That is the Theophrastus Ficino believed, who had preserved Aristotle's original view on the mind, stripped of all those perversions, with a silently established Aristotle as the most famous opponent of Plato. In Ficino's view, no one better than Aristotle's pupil and successor in the peripatetic school could have accounted for his master's genuine opinion on the intellect. We must keep in mind that from our perspective as modern scholars or modern readers of Theophrastus, Priscianus, and Aristotle, in reading the paraphrase, we must necessarily do a lot of unpacking to identify the different voices who take turns in speaking, sometimes even within the same passage. We have to see it through the Priscianus layer, then the Iamblichus layer, then Theophrastus, then Aristotle. Ficino didn't do that. He's aware, of course, of the 7 centuries that separated Priscianus and Theophrastus. and of the fact that Priscianus was constantly drawing on Iamblichus. But Ficino saw the three philosophers as alumni, so to speak, of the same school, that is the Platonic Academy. He had no reasons to think that Priscianus' Theophrastus might have been different from Aristotle's Theophrastus. So in reading Ficino's commentary, we must keep this in mind, and we shouldn't expect Ficino to do with Theophrastus what modern scholars have done with his fragments. So Ficino, as I said, translated this short paraphrase, and the final version of his translation and commentary was published in Venice in 1497, together with his paraphrase, the translation of Iamblichus de Mysteris. But let's see what in the paraphrase excited Ficino so much. The section on the Nous, on the intellect, after a lacuna, opens with Theophrastus' discussion of the idea of intellect as potentiality, where Theophrastus discusses Aristotle's definition of the mind as having no actual existence until it thinks, in the Anima 3:4. And this is quotation number 2 in the handout. Perhaps this would seem absurd if the intellect as the nature of matter be nothing but capable of being everything. But it must not be taken in this way, nor of all intellect, but is necessary to make distinctions. Of what kind then is it, and what is the basis of the distinction? For matter is not as this something, tode ti in Greek, yes, a substance for Aristotle. Matter is not a substance, is not a tode ti. But intellect, if it's not like this, what else would it be? We must therefore take the potentially also analogically with regard to the intellect that is connected with the soul. Prisciano calls it that psychikos nous, the intellect of the soul, the psychic intellect, which is the potential intellect, as opposed to the agent intellect. So this is our intellect. So the intellect connected with the soul. For this, it must be interpreted in relation to the intellect in actuality, that is, that which is separate. So this is from Prisciano's text, from the paraphrase. So here Theophrastus, through Priscianus, says that when applied through the psychic nous, to our psychikos nous, potentiality should be taken analogically. And it is very likely that he derived the expression psychikos nous from Aristotle and the Anima, that when he called okalumenos tes psyches nous, that is that part of the soul which we call mind and has no actual existence until it thinks. And Theophrastus seems to be aware of the risks involved in Aristotle's language, that is, that a plausible interpretation of this intellect would be pure potentiality. And his goal seems to have been proving that we can understand this psychic nous as potential, that is able to think the universality of the intelligible forms without depriving it of its nature as a tode ti, as a substance, as this something, as existing as such, even before thinking in actuality, even before thinking the forms. Now, the heart of Ficino's interest is to understand what Theophrastus means by analogy, when Priscianus says that this must be taken analogically. But first, let's see how Priscianus himself comments on this passage, which may be irrelevant if we want to get to the bare bones of Theophrastus' view of Aristotle's mind. However, since it is Ficinus Theophrastus that we are interested in today, not Theophrastus himself, we cannot leave out the interpretation given by Priscianus, which has informed Ficinus' reading of Theophrastus. So Priscianus says, quotation number 3, the intellect connected with the soul, again, psychikos nous, as you can see in the Greek, is neither like matter nor like sense, for it is both a form and a container of all forms by its own being, and is active of its own accord, and in itself contains the objects of intellect. But through its kinship with the soul, and through its essential relationship with it, and through its inclination, as it were, towards the divisible, it itself has descended from the inviolably undivided and entirely united intellective substance and actuality. And the continuity in between the two has been loosened in a way. And for anyone familiar with Iamblichus, we can really see Iamblichus here, giving voice to Theophrastus through Priscianus. The psychic intellect, the psychikos nous, distracted by the commotion of material life, is no longer present to its objects, a condition which it obtains, as Priscianus puts it, when the continuity in between the two intellect has been loosened. The verb, the Greek verb kalao, as you can see in here in the last sentence of the quotation, there's the synekeia he amphoin synekeia ke kalasmene. So the continuity has been loosened, has been relaxed. So the verb is in Greek kalao, as is used not only by Priscianus but many late ancient Platonists to describe the loosening of actuality, of unity, in this context of the continuity between the two intellects. In the paraphrase, for example, the term appears 4 times, and in Pseudo Simplicius' commentary on the Anima, a good 12 times. And it represents a striking example of the yearning of language to describe what cannot ultimately be described, which is so distinctive of the late ancient Platonist philosophical writing. The yearning expressed by the verb kalao is for a definition of divided unity or alienated identity that is the predominant modality in the shifting territory between being and becoming in Plotinian and post-Plotinian philosophy. So what I think Ficino found interesting, exciting in this passage is the idea that despite the connection with the soul, with the human soul, and the inclination towards the divisible, towards matter, this intellect, the psychic intellect, still remains the agent of thinking in act, and is not made, but makes itself think in act. Indeed, we can see that, and I have highlighted it for you in the Greek, how Prisciano uses how to itself 3 times in the line when he describes the nature of that intellect. And this suggests that his intention was to stress the fact that besides the illumination coming from above, agency belongs simply and solely to the psychikos nous, to the psychic intellect. And see what he says a few lines below the following quotation. it itself brings itself into perfection, both by being aroused of itself and by fitting itself to the intellect in actuality, and by receiving its perfection from that through its own activity. And since it has not entirely gone out from the intellect in actuality, but also descended, is joined to it even so, in that it is itself also intellect, hence also not turning outward in any direction, but entering into itself and being brought together with itself as much as possible, it is also brought to perfection by the intellect in actuality. For these reasons, therefore, it is affected in a different way from the senses. And in general, it is affected not in the proper sense, but homonymiously, and is rather active. Here again, lexical choices indicate that the actualization of thinking is a spontaneous action of the psychic intellect. The adjective autenergetos, which means acting by itself, spontaneous, was often used by Iamblichus. And here Priscianus has it in the adverbial form, to show that the act of receiving is not a passive acceptance, but is an active process. And Priscianus goes as far as to say that not only the intellect is not potential in the same way as the senses are potential, but that in fact is not potential at all. It is active. Edmond Barbotan, who edited and studied Theophrastus' fragments on the intellect, takes these words as genuinely coming from Theophrastus. However, we don't find this sentence in Themistius. In fact, all passages where Theophrastus explicitly claims that the psychic intellect is active are not in Themistius, which may lead us to think that this is Priscianus' view rather than Theophrastus. But I don't think that Priscianus' interpretation is totally unjustified. Because if we go on and read quotation number 5, we find something that is both in Priscianus and Themistius. So it's genuinely Theophrastus's. And it's the starting point from that, the object or from itself. For by the fact that it is affected, it would seem to be from that. For none of the things that are being affected acts of itself. But from the fact that thinking is the starting point of everything and in its own power, and not as with the senses, it would seem to be from itself. So here Theophrastus is talking about the intellect which is affected, that is the psychic intellect, our intellect, and defines it as the arche, the source, the origin of thinking. It would be interesting to go on and compare Priscianus and Themistius to see to what extent the view of the potential intellect as self-agent is genuinely Theophrastus's. However, as I said, we are not concerned with Theophrastus himself today, but what he said for Ficino. And for Ficino, Theophrastus says everything that Priscianus makes him say. So, like Ficino, I will take Priscianus' quotation at face value. However, claiming that potentiality must be taken analogically, and that is in fact a kind of actuality or potentiality mixed with actuality, didn't really solve the enigma of the nature of Aristotle's Nous pathetikos. In fact, it seemed to complicate the question of its relation with the other intellect, with the Nous poietikos, with the agent intellect, even further. For why would we need a productive intellect if the potential intellect is self-productive and in fact is the arche, is the origin, the source of thinking? Also, if the potential intellect is not its own thoughts, but is not either the pure possibility of them, what is it then? This question led at the core of Ficino's interest in Theophrastus when he read the paraphrase, read and translated the paraphrase. For if the intellect is a substance, that is a mind, which Theophrastus seemed to have believed, and has the power of self-actualization, as Prisciano makes clear, why are we not always thinking? And why, even when we think, we don't think everything that is thinkable? So these were crucial questions for Ficino. And to understand the nature of the nous pathetikos, of the potential intellect, Ficino believed that the notion of potentiality should be revised even further. See how he comments on the above passage from Priscianus, from the passage number 4. This one, when Priscianus highlights the fact that the potential intellect is not actualized, but actualizes itself. So now we're going to read Ficino's interpretation of that passage in Priscianus. So number 6. Our intellect, which is called possible, that is formable by the first intellect, has an inborn and free act of its own, by means of which is converted from itself to itself and to its inborn forms. Then it's converted to itself and to its own forms as much as to the first intellect and its forms. From the first intellect and its forms, the same intellect and its forms are formed. That is, the intellect becomes more discerning, and thus the forms become brighter. Joined as close as possible to these forms, this intellect of ours is something of the same nature of the soul. They speak of a similar free act through which angels are converted to themselves and through themselves to God. This is proof that the forms are inborn and that this intellect of ours is naturally united with the divine, because once it's converted to itself, it finds all things and is made divine. When we say that the potential intellect is formed by the agent intellect, we don't mean that it receives the forms, but that in the presence of the agent intellect, it uses its own forms more efficiently and more intimately. I'm not too sure about this translation. In Latin, it's even stronger. It says, if you read just here, sed illo presente formis suis efficacius et copulatius ut. In copulatius, we have the idea of the embrace, of the contact, of becoming one with the forms. I have translated as more intimately, but if you have suggestion for a better translation, I'm happy to take it. So in the potential intellect, there's no motion, no passion as such. So here we have a transition from potentiality to actuality that occurs ex se, from itself, and ad se, to itself, which places the power of agency entirely within the potential intellect. The expression here, if you read, innatum actum proprium et liberum, an inborn and free act of its own, serves the same purpose. Indeed, the potential intellect, Ficino explains, is the locus of intelligible forms. In the presence of the agent intellect, it uses these forms more efficiently and more directly, more immediately. But Ficino's point here is that all the other times, that is when the potential intellect doesn't access these forms directly, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the forms or that it doesn't access the forms at all. It still does, which means that it still thinks. So it thinks on a different level. Here we cannot but mention Aristotle's famous analogy in the Anima 3:430a1 that the passive intellect is the capacity of a tablet with nothing yet written on it. Iamblichus, as reported by Pseudo-Philoponus, had noted that Aristotle spoke of a writing tablet, not of a sheet of papyrus. For on which nothing is written stood for ill written, badly written, because it has faint, non-evident written letters. As also we say of a tragic actor with a bad voice, we say that he has no voice or she has no voice, but doesn't mean that he's not able to speak at all. Having no voice, Iamblichus says, doesn't mean that he doesn't have the ability to speak, but that he doesn't speak well or clearly enough as he could or should be an actor. This was Iamblichus' view. But see what Priscianus says on the tablet, obviously quoting Iamblichus, number 7. And therefore, we must understand the unwritten tablet by analogy with it, the intellect connected with the soul, the potential intellect. For it is like that, not as having the forms at all, but just as it itself is intellect potentially, not as not being intellect at all, but as being intellect of such a kind as to need to be perfected by the first intellect. So also the intelligibles in it are indeed intelligibles, but such as to need the illumination from those that are separate, so that they may be purely intelligible. Sorry. So here again, another adverb which I have highlighted here. Nous is very important for Ficino. He renders it in Latin as sincere. And it was key to understand the notion of potentiality and actuality as applied to the intellect. So as the actor mentioned by Iamblichus didn't cease to be an actor even when he mumbled, or when the pitch of his voice did a bad job in conveying the character's emotions, so the nous patheticos didn't cease to be a substance, specifically a nous, a thinking substance, even when his thinking was not purely intellectual. So see now how Ficino comments on this passage from Priscianus, number 8. There are those who write on a paper using onion juice, but the words cannot be seen unless one hits the paper. Of this kind are the forms which belong to the so-called potential intellect, which become visible in the presence of the divine fire, just as colors become visible in the presence of the light of the sun. Our intellect is not in potency in this, that is, that it becomes the intellect and intelligibles, but with respect to the ultimate perfection of intelligence and the intelligibles. So here becomes clear how Ficino takes Theophrastus' advice to interpret potentially in a different way. The so-called potential intellect is not potential either to the agent intellect or to thinking. The former alternative, being potential to the agent intellect, is unacceptable because it would imply bifurcating the unitary nature of intellect, a mistake which for Ficino was at the origin of the wrong interpretation of both Alexander and Averroes. The other alternative, being potential to thinking, would be equally misleading, for it suggests that before thinking, the intellect doesn't think, which is absurd given the fact that it is an intellect, unless we admit the existence of a non-thinking intellect, which is certainly not what Aristotle had in mind. So how we should take potentiality? Potentiality, in Ficino's view, means potentiality, as he says in this quotation, with respect to the ultimate perfection of intelligence and the intelligibles. That is, to thinking in act. So for Ficino, in the De Anima, Aristotle distinguished between two levels of operation or levels of access to the intelligibles, to the forms, within one single intellect. One impure, to use Prisciano's vocabulary, and one pure. Ficino has no doubts about what these levels correspond to, and what we do when we think purely as agent intellects and when we think impurely as potential intellects. For him, Aristotle's agent intellect and potential intellect corresponds to the level of operation of the soul that we call rational thinking, ratio in Latin, which we can translate as discursive thinking or reason, and which includes all those activities performed by the Platonic dianoia. So the potential intellect, the nous pathetikos, has the ability, through what Ficino calls an inborn and free act of its own, to think purely, that is, to engage in self-identical thinking, which is not simply self-identical, but also consciously self-identical. This level of noetic life is what Ficino calls intellectus or intelligentsia. Ratio and intelligentsia, reason and intellect, are not two different entities, but indicate the unfolding of different levels of cognitive perfection in accordance with the shift in the predominant modality from potentiality into actuality. And this becomes clear if we read quotation number 9 from his Platonic theology. Bear in mind that Aristotle never called the agent and receptive minds two essences, nor did he put them above the soul. He called them the soul's parts and said they were two different powers in the soul. But should anyone call that Averroistic mind the soul, he would be abusing the word soul. So in Ficino, the potential intellect is our reason and is always associated with motion. It's thinking step by step, progressive thinking. It seems keen to preserve the idea of the dia in dianoia, the thinking in motion, in different directions, as opposed to the mobility of the intellect. Ratio, reason, after all, discurrit in Latin is discursive, currit runs from one side to side, from side to side. And Priscianus seems to be of the same mind. He says, quotation number 10, this man, namely Aristotle and Theophrastus, appear, as we have indeed already said, to call intellect sometimes even the whole rational life, where at any rate they extend the name of intellect even as far as the imagination. So in this passage, Ficino might have found a confirmation of his view that Aristotle's nous pathetikos is a way in which the intellect is accessed by the soul. That is, through an activity which still depends on images and as such is noetically impure. In thinking through images, the soul is not yet aware of its identity as a self-reflexive thinker, of its ability to put into effect actual thinking. In this and no other sense, for Ficino, can the intellect be said to be potential. The gap between the two intellects, in his view, is not metaphysical. The potential intellect does not acquire the forms from the agent intellect. He has the forms already. The gap is rather epistemological, as reason is potential to the activity of intellect, that is, to thinking in act. In other words, the potential intellect is potential to the full actualization of an action, which is its own action. So to conclude, in Ficino's view, no second intellect was ever introduced by Aristotle. The mind described by Aristotle was one, only one, but acted on two different levels, depending on whether it used reason or intellect. In the latter case, thinking was in act. In the former, it was potential to thinking in act. Yet it was still a todity, a substance, a mind, and was still thinking. Last quotation, number 11. The rational power is said to proceed from the power in act, not because it receives new forms, for it always has them all, but because now uses those that it did not use before. Theophrastus says that if intellect is simply in potency, just like matter, every time it understands by receiving new forms, it will undergo a change. This is absurd, as Theophrastus speaks of our intellectual intellect. So by speaking of the nous pathetikos, of the potential intellect, as our intellectual intellect, Theophrastus, Aristotle's devoted student, was able to reveal the true meaning of his master's words, that the mind is individual and is intellectual by nature. This is enough to justify Ficino's great excitement when he came upon the manuscript of Priscianus' paraphrase, and as he wrote to his friend Filippo Valori on the 25th of March, 1489, in that moment, I quote, Ficino says, "I had everything my heart desired, and so that others may also have the same satisfaction as soon as possible, I have translated this book from the Greek language into Latin." Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if you can share the handout with us. I don't know.
Oh, you're not seeing the handout?
No, we saw it, but maybe.
Oh yes, I will send it
for the Q&A. Yeah.
Of course, I will drop it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Just give him a moment. You should have got it now.
Me apagó el micrófono, doctora Teresa.
Yes, we received it. Thank you.
Okay. Good. I didn't make. Yeah, that
Sorry. I think my my microphone was closed. So we now have some time for questions, and we have the first one. So Ricardo, please.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your talk, Anna. Very interesting. I have a very general question, which is the following. In the Anima Book 3, the notion of impassivity, no, of apatheia, no, that turns up in chapter 5, no, apathes, no, the question whether nous is apathes and how it is apathes. This idea is related within Book 3 to the claim in chapter 4 that nous is apathes in connection with Anaxagoras, no? And it's this famous passage where Aristotle says, I'm reading the Revised Oxford Translation, this passage in chapter 4, no, where Aristotle says the following, no, the problem might be suggested if thinking is a passive affection, apathes, then if thought is simple and impassible and has nothing in common with anything else, as Anaxagoras says, no, how can it come to think at all? So in Aristotle, the discussion about impassivity, or no, in connection with intellect, this in chapter 5 is connected, no, to the discourse to the discussion of Anaxagoras in chapter 4. So my question is whether there is evidence in Theophrastus first, but also in Ficino, if there is evidence that they too connect the two discussions, no? I mean the discussion in chapter 5, no, about the supposed two intellects, and the discussion in chapter 4 with Anaxagoras, no? And I mean this connection that exists in the Aristotelian text, is it also brought out by Theophrastus and and especially by Ficino, no? I mean, does Ficino connect the two discussions as well, or not?
Okay, but probably Priscianus and Theophrastus have, but we don't, as I said, we have only a small part of the paraphrase, and we are missing the part where Priscianus comment and quotes Theophrastus on that part that you mentioned. So that is lost. I don't think that is in Themistius. I haven't looked, but I will. I'm taking a note because you're right. It's a very interesting connection that Aristotle makes. So it would be interesting to see how Theophrastus, Priscianus, and then the later readers and commentators have received it. So I can't really say about Priscianus and Theophrastus. Ficino, not as far as I know, but I would have to look probably at his manuscript of where he has the text of the De Anima, where to see if he has some notes on that specific passage. Now, in the works that I have in mind, I don't seem to recall that he makes that connection, which is though very, very interesting.
It is interesting and philosophically speaking, no, I mean the whole discussion. I mean, the connection between the two discussions is philosophically very interesting, no, and how Anaxagoras may have influenced Aristotle's conception of nous in chapter 5, no? So there is a philosophical connection, but I was looking at the text in the TLG, and they are really very close to one another. I mean, they are the discussion with Anaxagoras is in 429 B22, and chapter 5 begins 15 lines later. No, so I mean, it's. I mean, the two discussions are also textually, no, very close. So I mean, it's interesting how, I mean, if Ficino was reading the Anima,
he read the Anima for sure. Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
very closely.
How couldn't he connect the two? No, but so I mean, I'm not criticizing Ficino, no, but I'm just asking. I mean, what could be the reasons for not connecting the two? No, but but thanks a lot for your answer.
Yes, no, but also I think he would have interested in the connection between agency and impassibility, because they're obviously not the same thing. Because it seems really interested in agency, in self-agency, at least in the way he comments on Theophrastus passages.
Yes, but what do you, I mean, do you think that in Aristotle the passivity and impassibility are two different concepts? I mean, the term, I mean, you know the text better than I do, of course, but it's the same term, no? It's apathes, no? In the Anaxagoras discussion, no, he asks, "Aporeseye antis eichonus haplun esti kai apathes." And then in chapter 5, no, he says, "Kai hutos honus," and this nous is separate and apathes and amigues. But maybe, yeah, but I see what you mean, because there is, but I mean,
yes, but for Ficino, the question wasn't as much, well, that the agent, the separate intellect was apathes, was out of question.
Okay.
It was concerned in showing that the potential intellect, our intellect, was also in a way apathes and certainly self-agent.
I see.
It was concerned with the potential intellect.
No, yes, I did not understand what you were saying. Yes, no, thanks.
Thank you. I have two more questions.
Yes.
I can see two more hands.
Yes, Israel and then Andre. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your exposition. I have a question about the hypostasis of mens. In the theology, in the Platonic theology, Ficino talks about the hypothesis of mente angelica or mens angelica, and he equates this with the intellect. And there is the tradition of first the article of Allen that entitles the absence of angel, and
the absent angel, yes,
and the book of Simona Felina, which both affirms that there is a gap between the first principle and the soul, and is this hypostasis, which is the mens angelica, that is not clear where finish the mens and begins the soul. And this discussion about the intellect is very I mean, is very in the tenor of the intellect, but not of the angel. Have you thought anything about this, following the title of Allen? Have you think anything about that?
But if you see in one of the quotations, from the commentary on Christianus, he mentions the angels.
Yes.
I've noticed that.
Yes, where he talks about the intellect naturally united with the divine.
Yes, so there he's comparing intellect in act, that is the agent intellect of Aristotle, to the angelic mind that is one and the same with the forms that it contemplates.
Yes.
So that mind, the angelic mind, which Ficino often compares with the Plotinian Nous, the second hypostasis in the metaphysical hierarchy in Plotinus, that is the intellect which is self-thinking and one and the same with the forms. Ficino sometimes compares that and calls that the angelic mind. And here it makes a clear connection. We've read it in his own words, that thinking in act is what angels do. And so what is this exists outside of the soul as an angelic mind, as an hypostasis of comprising all the minds of the angel, but also inside our soul as the highest faculty that we can perform, that we can access, because we can also think purely like the angels, like the angelic mind. We can also contemplate the forms. So I'm not sure if, I mean, you seem to be perplexed about the relationship between the hypostasis and the human soul as regard the hypostasis of the angelic mind and the human soul, right? I think for me, the human soul can have access to the same thinking in act of the angelic mind, even though this is external to the soul.
And what will be the function of the formula in, because it's not the connection, is the connection between the soul and the mind. What in this, the question is, Ficino thinks in the formula that he exposed in the Platonic theology or not in this Priscianus translation?
Sorry, I don't understand what is the formula. What do you mean by that?
In the Platonic theology, he exposes that in the mind in the human mind, there is a formula, which is a form, the form, as in Latin, the diminutive of form, he called formula. And he thinks that in our mind, we have formulae that connect with the forms.
Yes.
So my question is if Ficino is thinking in the formula when he is translating Priscianus.
Well, not specifically. In the background, of course, there's this idea that we have the forms. Yes, actually, the answer is yes, because he says we, as potential intellects, have the forms. But these are not the forms as they exist outside of the mind. They are formula, as you said. They are our forms. They are reflection of those forms that we have inside ourselves. Of course, when we access our own forms, we immediately get access also to the higher reality of the forms as external realities. So when he says that the intellect, our potential intellect has the forms, this is exactly what he means. He has itself these perfect ideas that exist. Now the question is, in which form do we have them? Is a reflection, an image, is a diminished form? I'm not too sure about the question, but about the answer to this question, but there's certainly a connection between our diminished version of the perfect forms, formula, as you said, and the forms themselves.
Okay.
Have I
you.
answered your question?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to take a note because it's a very interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you. Andre?
Yes, thank you very much. That was great. I have two questions. One general and one suggestion for your text number 7. The general question: do you think that there is an analogy between the way in which Theophrastus or Priscian deal with the question of the passive nous, and what Theophrastus, Priscian, says about aistasis? Because the problem of passivity activity also raises in the case of aistasis.
Of course, yeah.
And so what I think that there might be conclusions to be drawn from a parallel, if the parallel exists, but I'm not sure of it. And so let me, so that was the first question. And then just to, if you can take your text number 7.
Yes.
So I think your translation is not right of the first sentence, and therefore we must understand the unwritten tablet by analogy with it. Katalanogian ep autu, I wonder whether that can mean this. And
sorry, the quotation of that is let me find it.
7.
Yes.
So in the first line of the Greek, you have
6, 1 second. Yeah, I wanted to say this is not my translation. Is Pamela Habi's translation.
Okay.
But I am translating the text now from the Greek. I'm translating both Ficino's Latin and Prisciano's Greek, but I haven't got that far yet.
Okay. So
but
I think
this translation by Pamela Habi has many problems.
Yeah, so that's one of them. Okay, good.
Yes, so number 7.
That doesn't, yeah.
Yes, the written tablet, kata analogia, by analogy. Yeah.
Epautu is not with it. It's applied. It's in this case, in its case.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's not. I mean, if it's not your translation, it's not.
No, I mean, because for these words, I've been using the available translation because it's taken me a while to translate it Prisciano.
No, okay.
I want to all the time I'll go and look what Ficino actually has in Latin, and surprisingly, it seems to have always a better translation than the modern ones.
That's not surprising.
No, it's not. But if you think we have so many centuries of scholarships and still, so your first question about sense perception, yes, absolutely, because the first part, as you may know, of the paraphrase is devoted to sense perception. How specifically to what Aristotle says that the organ of sense becomes like the object that is sensed. So again, here we have the idea of being affected and being the becoming like, and all of this. And Prisciano also, when talking about sense perception, stands to avoid the passivity, the explanation by passivity in this very Iamblician sense, of course. What he says is that the soul has a rational principle, a logos within itself, and actually is this logos that makes sensation possible. It's not that this sense organ is passively affected. When the sense organ comes into contact with the object, then this logos is activated and become connected with the other rational principle of the object. So this kind of encounters of rational principles, which in a way makes a sense perception a completely active process.
Yes.
And he makes, at least Ficino does make the comparison between what passivity means in sense perception and what it means in intellection. And it says, as we can read in the quotation, it's even more active than in sense perception. For Bresciano had just said that even sense perception is not passive.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting because it allows to get out of the problematic of 4 and 5 of book 3 and 5 and relate it to 2 and to 2.5, right? And well, I don't know what the conclusions are to be drawn from that, but it seems to be an advantage not to concentrate only on the terrible difficulty of 3, 4, 5, but
yes,
also to see that it has an analogy in the case of sense perception. So
exactly what they did,
good.
I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Edgar?
Yes, thanks, Anna, for this very interesting talk. I just have a question regarding, a doubt regarding Ficino's view on the relationship between imagination, fantasia, and nous, right? You said something at the end, but my doubt was, I mean, Ficino seems to take, as you suggest, I mean that humans can think, just say purely, right? Like just like the angels can think of forms, that kind of thing. But there are several places, especially in the Anima 3.7, 3.8, and in the Memoria, where Aristotle says that thinking never occurs without a phantasma, right? Without an image, right? Noe. I mean, yes, he says, he uses noe, noein. No? The soul never thinks without an image. And so this means that, and if this is true of humans, then and if since fantasia requires perception and perception requires a body, then it seems that human thinking cannot occur, let's say, without a body. And but angels do not have a body, so their thinking should be quite different from human thinking because it is not mediated by fantasia, by images. So I was wondering whether Ficino says or tackles this difficulty at some point, and I would be interested to know what you think about it.
Yes, so Ficino is more Plotinian in this sense as regards the relationship between imagination and intellect. For him, pure thinking is thinking without images.
Yep.
It's even thinking without discursive reason, so without comparison, without calculation, is pure contemplation. So it's true that when we say that we don't think without images, for Ficino, this could be true if we refer to rational thinking, because rational thinking is still very dependent on space and time. So probably this is what Aristotle had in mind, the dianoia, this kind of thinking that is embodied thinking, that is discursive, that is thinking progressively, step by step. For that kind of thinking, we need images, and Ficino agrees with that. But for the other thinking, the higher kind of thinking that is the same as the way angels think, we don't need, actually, we are completely free from images at that stage. So once our mind reaches that level, he has abandoned the imagination completely, but not only imagination, even reason.
But then there is a capacity, I mean, for Ficino, it is capacity that can be exercised about any topic. I mean, it's not that just, let's say, some topics that are, or some objects of thought that are farther removed from the senses are the ones that are, let's say, that humans are able to think without images. But in a sense, any topic can be.
I believe it's a level of operation of the mind rather than what the mind is actually thinking in that moment. It's not a matter of the content of thinking, but of the way we think. As he said, purely or unpurely. We may think, for example, of this pen in a way in space and time, and focusing on the image of the pen or remembering the pen, whatever. But we may also think of the same object in a pure way, thinking about its form, which, of course, I'm not able to do it now that I am in this body, but probably when I leave the body, or if I purify my soul enough, I will be able to do that. So I think for him, it's are different levels of operation. The imagination is essential for incarnate, embodied thinking, that is the anoia, but the contemplation, the theorein, that of the pure thinking is without, doesn't need the imagination.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Yes, certainly.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have answered your question.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, that's a possible reading, right, of Aristotle, to say that. Yeah, when he says that the soul never thinks without a fantasy.
I'm not saying that I've read this, that Ficino has interpreted, that it never said, at least as far as I know. This is what I think Ficino would say, would answer, you ask them directly, but I might be wrong.
Okay, well, that's
because I know this is what he thinks, but I don't know if he would apply this explanation to Aristotle. I think he would, but he never says that.
Okay.
So this is my interpretation.
Yes, no, that's fair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paola?
Yes, thank you. Hello, Anna.
Hello.
Well, I must say I'm not familiar with Ficino's philosophy, so my question is of a rather clarificatory nature. So I just wonder whether his interpretation or his proposal was that the soul or the intellect in Aristotle worked with innate ideas. And let's see if I can say why. Because so in order to avoid this duality of intellect or having two intellects of different nature, if I'm following you correctly, he says that, well, the passive and the potential intellect is potential only by analogy or homonymously, and that his way of explaining this is by saying that it is potential in relation to the active part of the intellect, which means that it actualizes itself, and so with its own forms, and thus the idea of the clean slate is not exactly a clean slate, but rather a sheet with magic ink in which things are, or not things, but forms are already written. You just the active intellect has to unveil them or activate them, perhaps. And so that to me sounds as though first of all, the forms are already in the soul. And that's why I'm thinking, I don't know if that means for Ficino that Aristotle's Nous was a sort of, containing innate ideas. And the other thing is that if it actualizes itself, that to me sounds as though it is not only a proposal of innate ideas, but also a sort of enclosed intellect. And it just a bit weird or a bit odd to me to think in those terms Aristotle's Nous, because as far as I understand, the proposal, Aristotle's proposal of the form of forms has to do with exactly the opposite, with explaining how the human intellect can relate to things in the world. And but saying that it actualizes itself just with its own forms, and actually those are very strong words. It's more copulatio, more uniting it strongly with itself, so to speak. So it suggests to me that it is enclosed. I don't know if that was Ficino's proposal.
Well, we have to keep in mind that Ficino is a Platonist and very committed Platonist. So when we say the forms are in us, and we were, I think, discussing this with Israel a while ago, we can take it. I mean, speaking of innate forms will be a bit anachronistic for Ficino, I think. It's more of a later concept. But from a Platonic perspective, we have to keep in mind that knowledge is remembering. So that when we become embodied, we do so after drinking from the river Lethe, as in Plato's Myths of Her, so the river of forgetfulness. So we come into this life and we forget the forms. So when we learn the forms, we're just remembering the forms. So what does this mean? It means that they are either in us as little formulae, as images of external realities, or, and this is what I think Ficino really meant, that was really important for him, the human mind as an innate access to the forms. We are not given that access by an external intellect or by God. We are born with that capacity of seeing the forms or remembering the forms. So when we say that the intellect actualizes itself, it means that under some circumstances, we are able to see the forms. We see the forms that we'll not ignore them anymore, but we see, oh yes, here they are. I've seen this before. It's not that we are made, we are told to look at the forms by another, a separate entity that makes us think the form. Not all happens within our nature, because we have this direct access to the forms. And this is what he criticized in Averroes' interpretation of Aristotle, that the potential intellect doesn't have in itself the ability to think, but it has to receive this ability from the outside. For Ficino wanted to prove that the soul can think by its own nature, by itself, even if we don't do that as embodied selves all the time, but nevertheless we have that ability as part of our human nature, part of our human mind.
Okay.
May I just add? May I just
Yes,
insist on?
Yes.
Does that mean that, or implies that, it is, as I was saying, somehow enclosed? I mean, how does, according to Ficino, how does the soul relate to the external world, if it does?
The forms.
The soul, the
Oh, the soul.
intellect. I mean, if it actualizes itself with itself, does it relate to the external world?
It does, because we, the world, we are, and we live in this world. So the world for him is a manifestation of the forms at a lower level. This world is an image, a reflection of the forms, is a Platonist. So even when we go for a walk, no, we see a dog on the street, or we look at a flower, whatever we do in our everyday life, we are looking at the forms. We're not looking at the forms in their pure form, but only their reflections. So this world in which we live is essential for the embodied soul to get access to the divine reality of the forms. We get access to the forms through looking space and time, living in space and time, you know, what we do every day in our everyday life. There's also another level where we can contemplate the forms as completely in their immateriality and purity. This is the highest level of the intellect. But even when we look at things in this world, we are looking at the forms, a reflection of the forms. So we don't have to think that there is a denial of this world, that Plato, Ficino wanted to live enclosed in his soul, thinking about the beauty and divine. No. The world is a manifestation of the forms. So it's a way where, the place where we can encounter the forms, not in the purely, but impurely.
Well, thank you. And Ricardo?
I can't hear anything.
I'm sorry.
I think you were muted.
I forgot, yes. I forgot to turn on my
Yes.
microphone. Yes, sorry. What I wanted to say is I wanted to go back to Edgar's question about the relation between thinking and images, no? And your reply was that, well, discursive thinking may require images, but not contemplation, no? So how I mean, it's a very, I mean, out of curiosity, no, or philosophical curiosity, how do you understand this contrast between discursive thinking and contemplation? Is it a difference between intuition and thinking that is divided into steps, into logical steps where there are inferences and premises? And is that a difference, or is it rather a difference between a contrast between thinking that is propositional, no, in which I entertain thoughts that are propositions, and non-propositional thinking, which is more like kind of seeing, you know? I don't know how do you? I mean,
Yes, I believe it's exactly that what you said.
Right.
So reason, the level of ratio, discursive thinking is thinking in space and time. Is embodied thinking. I'm thinking of an object, and I'm thinking of an object in this particular place, seen at this particular time, and making a comparison between this object and a similar object that maybe I saw yesterday. So it's thinking step by step. Yes, it's intellect, contemplation is intuition. It's out of time and space. And it's very rare that it can happen while we are embodied. Usually when we are within the world of generation, space and time, we're not able to perform pure intuition. We still think progressively through images.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, in Ficino's psychology, epistemology is really Plotinian in this. So it really follows Plotinus very closely in his description of what thinking is at different levels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Simia?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your very interesting talk. Well, I had almost like the same question Dr. Sayes had asked. Well, I was wondering, does the content of this intellectual activity, the content with which it works, does not come from perception, right? Or does it?
They do, yes. Okay, because as well, again, we have to think that we are in this body for this short period of time that for Ficino, we live in this body. So we work through sense perception, and then through the imagination, and then through reason. So sense perception is a way to start the process of knowledge while we are on Earth. So we can reach the level of intellection through sense perception if we become progressively emancipated from the materiality, of course, of knowledge. Or in very rare occasion, we can, like, for example, Socrates or Plotinus himself, or Ficino, in Ficino's example, Moses or St. Paul's, you know, they were blinded completely by God, so they lost the sense perception. It was really symbolic of losing sense perception in order to see with the mind. So both are true, but seeing with the mind, losing sense perception, happens only to a few people in very few occasions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you. So you mentioned that in his interpretation of Aristotle's Nous, Ficino incorporated different voices like Priscianus and Iamblichus, Theophrastus, and he did not differentiate between them. But I was wondering if Aquinas was one of those voices or not in this special discussion.
Certainly, Aquinas is very important in Ficino's criticism of Averroes and in his reception of Aristotle. At that time, you know, they studied Aristotle through Aquinas, and Averroes through Aquinas' criticism. So in the Platonic theology, certainly Aquinas is a filter for his reading of Aristotle, and is also pretty evident because he quotes him often. In the paraphrase, not so much, no, not at all actually, or at least I haven't realized that, but because he's commenting on that work. The Platonic theology is his own treatise, so he can blend together as many voices as he wants. There, in the Priscianus commentary, is really writing a specific commentary on a specific work. So in his style, it would be acceptable to say, oh yes, Aquinas says this as regards, but it doesn't. But he wouldn't, I mean, being a commentary, not a treatise, he wouldn't have felt like bringing in Aquinas as much as he does in his own philosophical work. But on a general level, for the interpretation of Aristotle and Averroes, Aquinas is essential for Ficino.
Okay. Thank you. And I was wondering, how did Ficino, got Prisciano's manuscript, or can you tell us about that story a bit?
Yes, now I don't know about the specific manuscript. How did it end up in the hands of Ficino? But it was certainly part of this Platonic manuscript that came to Italy. Either they were brought to Italy from the Greek emigres from Byzantium, or they were bought by learned book collectors that were in the circle of the Medici family, as it happened, for example, with the Plotinus manuscript that was bought by a friend of Cosimo de' Medici and brought into Italy, and then acquired by Cosimo de' Medici, who gave Ficino the task of translating it. Now, I'm not too sure who brought this manuscript in Italy, but it's either one way or the other, was brought with somebody from the East or was bought by one of the Italian collectors. But it's something that for my book, I will have to investigate.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know, are there any more questions? Or okay, so I think we can close this session of the seminar. Thank you very much, and I enjoy your talk very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun, and thank you for the interesting discussion.
Okay, and thank you everyone for attending the seminar. Well, we'll see each other next month, I think, right?
Okay, perfect. So I will be receiving like like a newsletter or a list.
Sure, we can include your email in our list, and we'll be honored if you attend the next session.
Of course, with pleasure. If this time is a good time for me.
Okay, great. Well,
thank you so much, everyone. Yes. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.